Hi everybody. So I'm Duncan Burnson. I'm a Senior Urban and Design Officer for Medway Council, and have been leading the code from the internal council perspective.
Thanks. And I'm Scott Adams. I'm partner of urban design at BPTW, and we led the consultant team. As you can see, there's quite a few logos on the front page, but there's always quite a big team involved in these projects, and we help coordinate movement, landscape, engagement, and testing, and university students testing it as well. Sorry, it's not moving. There it goes. We started the project out, and we didn't put an overview of the actual design code because we've done that many times before. But early on, Matthew Carmona, as part of the Place Alliance, picked up the work I think that CABE did years before, and they did an audit of housing schemes across England, and they found that the highest quality schemes were those that actually followed a design code or underwent a process of design review. So, as a starting point, it's really interesting that the local authority-led design codes are looking to raise design quality, but also add certainty and speed in the planning system. And with Chatham, we were looking at how you could link the design code also with design review to potentially have the best chances to deliver design quality. Obviously, the National Model Design Code sets out the guidance structure for the design code. And those are the three stages of analysis, vision, and code. And it's a very simple process. And as you can see, the contents for the Chatham Centre Design Code, it becomes a very comprehensive document. And so we've got about just shy of 200 pages in the main body of the document, but there is repetition. So for area types, if you're within one area type, you're only looking at that guidance and design coding. You're not looking at the others. So there are duplicate layers of information that you wouldn't read if you're actually following the design code. But I think what's important is you see the three different areas. The one is the chapter 2, the Chatham 2050 vision and area-wide guidance. And that's essentially setting the design principles and having guidance that applies across the entire town centre. And so there's guidance to follow at that stage. More detailed are the coding plan and area type guidance requirements in chapter 3. That's where there's a whole series of specific area types where it details exactly what you need to do. Chapter 4 is master planning areas, and those are areas that are more defined within the boundary that you may be in or may not be in, but it aims to introduce new routes and spaces that connect to the high street. So if you're in it, it's about looking at if your site might contribute to one of those routes, you might have to set back a building or look at different ways of configuring the site. And so on this next page, it shows the coding plan, and this clearly highlights the different areas that are subject to different coding rules. So the high street is in Chatham Cross. It has a height restriction of 3.5 stories to meet with the existing context. You go to where you see the brook, the yellow area, that's urban avenues. And in areas of urban avenues, you can go up to 5 stories with a setback mansard roof or a stepped setback top story. So this just demonstrates for DM purposes that there's different rules that you have to follow specifically to the area types. We set out the vision for the area types. This one is streets and spaces, and you start seeing on the right some of the images that backs up some of the coding. So we try to illustrate where possible what this looks like in practice. So the bottom right diagram just shows max 10 meters wide, and there is this rhythm of trying to reflect historic patterns of development. So saying that facade must be 10 meters wide, and if it's a larger plot, you have to create that rhythm within your plot, and there's design coding to mandatory design coding to follow.
So perhaps I could add something to that, could I? Just
Sure.
As you can imagine, because this discussion is very much about post-adoption, as you can all imagine, it's quite a task actually for DM officers to really understand the detail in these codes. Now we are undertaking training and have considerably more to do actually with our DM officers, and even though they were part of the process, the building of the code, nonetheless, and commented on it quite considerably. Nonetheless, to get to use it at a practical level, you really do need to get to grips with the detail in these the specifics, and that's something which we're very much on the journey of, but it's something which I think it's worth recognizing is important to get to grips with, and I'll illustrate some of these other points as we go through these other slides, but that's the thing that really, where the rubber hits the road, as it were, once you start really using it. So the training is important, but also not just training, but also for officers to feel confident with it, and to be able to both follow it, but also feel they can manipulate within it, to be persuasive and negotiate around it is also important, I think.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, and realistically, understanding what's in the code is helpful, but there's quite a bit of information there. So the idea is that the introduction of a compliance checklist allows the applicants to complete the assessment, and I guess it comes with all the caveats. Let's say for building for a healthy life, we know that if an applicant's completing it for some funny reason, they get full greens. So it's just understanding that it's the starting point for DM to interrogate, to understand if is a guidance series of points to reference, I guess. So this first page just shows the area-wide guidance. In the vision for Chatham for 2050, there's the themes of healthy and connected, green and sustainable, heritage maritime city, and it's asking the applicants to say yes, they're complying with it, or partially, or not at all. And if it's any partial or no, there should be an explanation why. Similarly for the area type guidance, and that's where there's the more specific guidance for the area types. In this case, there's the Chatham Cross, the waterfront, urban avenues, streets and spaces, residential streets, and green edge. Applicants have to select which area type they're in, whether they've got a 3D massing model, and then the subcategories of the characteristics. So for each of those, we have 5 of the 10 characteristics of a high quality place. It's something like that. I've got that wrong. Matt will probably jump in. But 10 characteristics of a well-designed place. And we have movement, nature, built form, and uses. And so again, it's the same checklist of yes, the applicant complies partially, or they don't. And then an explanation is required for the partial or the non-compliance. And finally, if you're in a master planning area or not, you've got to clarify the site, if it's in it or not. And if you're in it, there's subcategories just to make sure that you align with the high level concept or not.
Scott, maybe I can add something, could I, just around those things? Mm-hmm. Is that a conversation we've had quite a lot about this, and particularly about relates to the checklists and the use of checklists and their value, but also their potential Achilles heel has been discussed relative to making the code so electronic. And the reason that's the case is that those 3 categories, as it were, checklist that Scott's described there, the more detailed one in the middle that you've described there about the area-wide codes, the challenge is that we found is for applicants and to not jump straight to that and ignore the area-wide guidance. Now we want people to, and anyone making applications and so on, looking at this, to understand the town in the round. In order to do that, they need to understand the area-wide guidance and its place within other areas. Then the detail fits within that, and then, as Scott was saying, the master planning areas in a way qualify certain parts of the town. I think it's very important that actually we're always encouraging applicants to understand the area-wide guidance, not jump straight to their area type, which is a tendency, and I think is even more of a tendency we're finding as we begin to think about how we put the code online and how it becomes more electronic, because it's in a sense easier to not read the whole PDF, for want of a better term, and instead to go straight to straight to the the area type guidance, which they think is relevant. So it's important that one's sort of ranging across those checklists and not using one exclusively rather than any of the others. Go on, carry on.
And also building on that, Duncan, we asked about if the applicant has a 3D massing model. And again, the important thing is we've looked at digital many different strands. And one is we've developed a masking model. So we've determined the interface between public and private realms, wherever that line is within the design code, and also the rhythm of the facades, and if there's a specified roof or not. And so once an applicant has a 3D massing model, then DM can start looking at whether it aligns with that, which is reflected in the overall masking model for Chatham, because it should adhere to those rules. And if it doesn't, it would be quite clear that it pops out from that as taller, or the rhythm of the facades don't line up, etc.
Scott, maybe it might be worth just adding as well on the back of your thing about the masking model. The reason we felt we needed a masking model, other than the fact that we were demonstrating the area type codes and how they apply themselves, is that there, as you can all imagine, I'm sure, there are many, many unique conditions that even though one has a code, it doesn't give all the answers. And a good example is so we are dealing with applicants at the moment, for instance, in pre-app, whose sites span perhaps 2 area types. And then as one turns the corner down the side of a street, which is the boundary of their site, that shift in area type changes along its length. And what are the conditions of that? How does one deal with that? Now, the code, with the best will in the world, can't give all answers. And so what the masking model does do is it demonstrates the principles, and then it makes the negotiation around the application of those principles in really specific terms simpler. And I think there's a real value in that, Scott, with the masking models being useful, actually, I think, for people to understand how manipulable the code is, as well as how it applies itself.
And realistically, I'm guessing you're finding, Duncan, as well, is that you're getting into the nuanced discussions about design, which potentially weren't what was happening previously, when it was about just height and massing for maybe months on end, for example.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, Scott. And I think it's probably useful for the post-adoption type discussion, Steve, for you guys. It speeds up that discussion considerably, Scott. And the other thing that we are finding. So to give an example, I'm dealing with a pre-app at the moment on a slot site, where in a packed part of the town, where we can't, if we allow windows on the flanks, we can't realize the rest of the sort of packed fabric that might happen around it. How does then the code deal with the flanks? How does it deal with lighting at the back, which are all things that we would have been, of course, doing through a series of pre-apps. But the difference with this is that the applicant's already thinking about for the first pre-app, because they have had to demonstrate to us, and I think our colleague from Uttlesford said something like this, where they have to demonstrate to us ways in which they believe they are answering or manifesting the code. So it doesn't rely on the planning officer to actually know all things about the code. The onus is upon the applicant to demonstrate how they are applying the code to their particular situation. So it brings the conversation forward, Scott, as you say, and it is already shortening timeframes, actually.
Yeah, and we understand that there'll be some non-compliance, and what we looked for in the design code was not only to have the code, but also the rationale. So if you are breaking the code, or if for some reason you can't meet it, or whatever the reason, there is a rationale that then should be kind of the spirit of the code. So if there is a slight variation or justification, it should fit within the rationale, or at least give DM officers the rationale to understand what should be discussed and what the focus of the code was. But equally, and I think in a really innovative way, and it goes back to that first slide of design review and design coding, When you do a design code, you're not going to have all the information, and you have to be specific. You've got to be measurable and binary wherever possible. We know that sometimes you've got to make some assumptions to get to that point because there's only so much you can know at that stage. But you also shouldn't be afraid to then not have those specifics within the design code, but it's trying to strike the balance. And where we know that applicants might want to break the code, let's say height, that's always a really easy one that probably happens more than not. We can accept height, but you have to go through an exemplary design process, which is a very considered design review process. And that's within the design code, the adopted SPD. And so as far as we're aware, it's the only design code that allows a code breaking through a considered design review process. And the successful design review process entails having applicants present how their scheme, how they align to the design code, but also where they have a divergence from it or divergences from it. And then there's a RAG rating of red, amber, and green of how successful they responded in design terms. And the idea is if you've got greens, that's great. If you've got ambers, it's cautionary, and the council can determine how to move forward if there's another design review. And if there's reds, the idea is that it doesn't meet the exemplary design standard and shouldn't be approved. But it does then go back to the council to make that decision.
Scott, just a few things I would add about that as well. I think our colleague from Uttlesford mentioned about the fact that that the code has offered members a good statement of intent as much as a practical tool to deal with applicants, and that's the first thing. And so the exemplary design process sits against the backdrop of that statement of intent, and members have been willing and able, and now are getting actually quite exercised about the fact that they understand and are expecting their ambition to be fulfilled. There are a couple of things on this process which are first worth mentioning, I think. One of them is that it is an exemplary design process. It's not just about good enough design process or a kind of almost exemplary process. It is an exemplary one, and therefore it is by definition demanding. And why would we do that? Well, largely it's because, of course, the code does describe already development which can be expected, if it is compliant, if schemes are compliant, to actually achieve planning permission more readily and faster. And I think we have to expect and I have said this to planning officers and to applicants: if you are compliant with the code and you're not beyond the code, you can anticipate that that the process will be faster and cleaner, and you're going to achieve permission. So that's one thing. In terms of the exemplary design process itself, in fact, we're dealing with another scheme because we're using the code quite a lot now, and a senior officer of ours, planning officer of ours, said the problem is, Duncan, isn't everybody going to be asking to be in the exemplary design process? And what's really interesting about this is that we forget the value of speed to developers. And actually, it's really quite fascinating. Now, schemes that are considerably challenged by viability and need to be an exemplary design process, that's one place where we find they're being used. And schemes where there's a particular kind of an ambition, then it's used. But for the remainder, the pace is more valuable actually than the exemplary design process. And I think that's really interesting. Now, this is what we're beginning to experience. So this is from schemes that we're dealing with on that. The other thing I would say about it is that and if anyone was minded to go on the same journey as we've been on with this, is that what it has required, it's required us to adopt a provider of the design process. It's required that provider to build a panel specifically for Chatham who are educated enough in the code and knowledgeable enough about Chatham in order to service it. And the reason for that is that we found very early on is that with the exemplary design process, if we didn't adopt a provider and have a quality of panel that could really deal with it, we found applicants, particularly larger schemes, were gaming the process. Now, this is just worth mentioning because of course, independent design review. Well, you could have a panel comes from anywhere. They can come from Glasgow and decide they're going to land in Medway, and it would be truly independent. So it's been and we went on this journey. Very fortunately, we were testing this with developers as we were developing it, Scott, weren't we? And this emerged as the fact that we were going to have to be more robust about this process. Actually, if we wanted to use it, we were going to have to be more robust. So that's really quite interesting, actually, that I think each of these processes we're finding in practice, they can be gamed in either direction. And so you've got to have the checks in place so that you can head off at the pass, those sorts of things. And that was a really good example of it, with the robustness we needed to build that exemplary design process with. I could probably go on, Steve. I should probably stop because otherwise we need time for questions. But hopefully that's focused enough on what we're dealing with as post-adoption.